Good afternoon and welcome to the PARC Forum. I'm Peggy Szymanski from the Computing Science Laboratory, and today's forum is part of a series of talks hosted by the Workscapes and Organization area around the theme, Quality of Life. Our speaker today is Bill Schilit from Google. Before joining Google, Bill was principal scientist with Intel's Digital Home Product Group and co-director of Intel Research Seattle. He was also part of the team that invented ubiquitous computing here at PARC from 1992 to 1995. He received his PhD in computer science from Columbia University, and his research interest is ubiquitous information with a focus on the development of personal and mobile technologies supporting knowledge work. Today, Bill will be talking about mining quotations from very large-scale digital libraries. Please join me in welcoming Bill Schilit.
Thank you. So this talk will be more about the knowledge work side of my research interests. And it's in collaboration with Okan Kolak, who's a researcher in Google Book Search. It's a product group. I'm in Google Research. So let me situate a little bit this research. We have a site called books.google.com, and you can go to this site and search scanned books. There's over 1 million scanned and OCR'd books. The full text is available for search. These come from 28 partner libraries in the US, Europe, and Asia, and also thousands of publisher partners deposit their books here. The books are in dozens of languages, and that's an issue in what we're trying to attempt here. So I just want to remind people that before the web, there was this other source of information called books, and there's a lot of them out there. And actually, it's not quite clear how many of them are out there, but unique volumes, about 30 to 150 million, depending on how you count and what you count. And many organizations, including Google, decided that in these books, there's information that isn't available anywhere else, and we should make it available. So we started these projects of scanning and OCRing, and these scanned and OCR'd volumes are really different than the rest of the web. So what's different here is that books are text and not hypertext. So the authors, when they wrote books, they didn't necessarily put links into them to other books, although there are some things like citations. And the documents are much, much bigger in books than on the web. So it's not necessarily good enough to sort of land somebody on a book and say, figure it out from here. The information is in this book. You know, I have 400 pages that a person would have to read through. So our approach to dealing with taking this massive text corpus and sort of bringing it online was to ask the question, can we make it more accessible by adding links? So what we did is we mined and then linked quotations that we found in books. I should mention that we already are generating links for citations, table of contents, related books, sort of a computed value, and also back of the book index. So there's all sorts of links that are already there, but we thought that there weren't enough links and they didn't really point to the information that was interesting. So the reason we picked quotation was we have an ocean of text, and there's only some small pieces in that ocean that are really interesting. Many books have lots of words, but some nuggets in them. And what we wanted to do was really expose those nuggets. And pretty much, you know, we thought of this as creating a hypertext of thoughts. You know, there's thoughts in books. Authors copy from one book to another, and they make quotations because those pieces that they copy have some extra meaning. So we wanted to sort of expose those bits of meaning and link them together. So also we wanted to give users the ability, or readers the ability, while they're reading a book and they see a quotation, to jump to the primary source of that quotation. It's often useful if the quote might seem not quite right or out of context. Or if you're reading the primary source, you might want to jump to some analysis of that quotation and see what are people saying about this. So the third reason why we're looking at quotations was we sort of had this wacky idea that if you took a big book, like Nietzsche's Man and Superman, and you only looked at the pieces that were highly quoted, you could create a summary of the book. So if you have a book report, it's midnight, you're a student, late at night, you got to read the book. Well, why don't you just read sort of the important nuggets, the ones that make sense. Now, what kind of quotations are we talking about here? There's lots of quotations. It's a very broad term to say the word quotation. On the one hand, there are things that a lot of people are familiar with, these cliches, bon mots, or Bartlett's kinds of phrases that you see a lot. Like, I have never let my schooling interfere with my education, famous Mark Twain quote. But what we're really looking for are a different style of quotation, something that's more historical, definitional, conceptual. A good example is, I shall not today attempt further to define it, but I know it when I see it. This is from a Supreme Court issue around, what was it around? Pornography, thank you. There was Justice Potter Stewart said this, and it really defined an issue, and it's used a lot when people are talking about that issue. So what we're really looking at are these kinds of quotes that are really pervasive through books, that aren't things that you might necessarily say at a cocktail party. And one thing that's really surprising is how many of these there are and the coverage of these across books. So let me give you some examples. Vannevar Bush defined trailblazers as finding delight in the task of establishing useful trails through the enormous mass of the common record. Last time we took a look, this was in 33 of the books that we have. Leo Szilard, the fellow who discovered chain reaction, has this kind of anecdote about how he did it while he was crossing the street, which is highly quoted in 43 books. Thomas Jefferson on government in 557 books. Spinoza, proposition, highly quoted. Jackson Pollock, how he does art. For some reason, he needs to put it on the floor and get resistance. It's not enough to have the paint drip. And this one, which you don't normally think of as a famous person, there's this thing called the Brundtland Report, which actually is a pretty good description, definition of ecopolitics. And the concept of sustainable development is an issue in ecology and politics, and this quote is used broadly when those topics are being discussed. So these are the kinds of quotes we wanted to get, because if you look at these quotes across these books, they're talking about the same issue, they define something, there's some kind of interesting connection to them. So I want to spend a few minutes on how not to mine quotations. These are all the ways that we tried and failed first. When you ask people, they say, well, why don't you just take Bartlett's? You probably already have that in your collection, and then just do a string search on Bartlett's. And the problem with Bartlett's is that it's a static data set. It doesn't really change. Where in our case, we have books that are being added all the time. And we also weren't so interested in a data set that's biased by editors who have defined what's important. We were interested in this wisdom of the crowds effect that let the authors who are writing the books define the important pieces in those books. So also, technically, if you were to take a list of quotations like Bartlett's and try and do search through them, you still have this problem that quotations don't exactly match. Language changes over time. People interject speech acts. Sometimes there's misquotation. So we also have OCR errors in our corpus. So this isn't so much a good solution, a good general solution. And then, the next thing that people ask is, well, why don't you just use quote marks? Just go look for some quote marks. All those things are quotes. So it turns out that a lot of this stuff with quote marks isn't quotes. It's dialogue. So you get a whole bunch of other stuff, and you miss a whole bunch of stuff that is quotes. So here it is maybe in the primary source, and here's a style of indentation. You also see styles of italics, boldface, and across languages, you see all sorts of styles of quotation. So if we were just to look for quote marks or try and pick up stylistic clues from the surface punctuation, would that work in Manchu or some other language? So it turns out it doesn't really work. And what does work is just this principle that a quote is a quote because it's been repeated. So that's the theory. Given a large enough corpus, you can find things that repeat, and those things are quotes. And we do have a large enough corpus. We have over 1 million books, and so we do see a lot of repeats. Now, this actually gets quotes, but it brings in a lot of other stuff that repeats. So it seemed like a good idea, and then you try it, and you find boilerplates. Penguin Books published. This is a copyright page. Citations actually are an interesting kind of repeat because this book reference repeats. And here's this woman who would always thank her editor at the beginning of all her books, and she wrote 20-odd books, and it was always thanking my agent, Marie Brown, for all their support. And of course, these things like tables of prime numbers repeat, tables of logarithms. We have all sorts of strange books in the collection that have texts that repeat. And one of the favorite things that we found, one of my interns dug this up. We found, right. So in the back of the books that we scanned from a library of a nearby university, they all had this little sticker that basically said, if your book is overdue, you're going to be fined for it. And this was in, 500 or 1,000 books. So we have a technique of finding quotes, but we also have this problem that there's a lot of other junk. So basically what we do is we mine these repeated texts. We call them sequences, repeated pieces of text. And then we filter out the really bad stuff, and then we rank everything else by its quotationness or its quotedness. And then we generate this link structure that lets users navigate within and across books. So the end result of this process is what we believe to be the world's largest known quotation collection. It's many orders of magnitude larger than the other online collections, the Columbia Book of Quotations, Bartlett's Quotations, et cetera. So I have 2 technical slides because this is a Google talk. I think I should mention, all the machine hours that we put into this. and just forgive me, bear with me, I'll explain at a high level what's going on. So what we do here is a technique called shingling, which is a popular technique in information retrieval nowadays. And basically what you see here is the concept of shingling, which is a sliding window of a fixed size across a text that produces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Here it's a 8 shingling. It produces a string of 8 words that sort of moves. And it's like a shingle on a house, they overlap. And the reason we use shingling is because what we can do with a shingle is we can use this instead of sentences which aren't well defined, especially across languages. And it provides us a way of concisely representing text. We actually take a shingle and we compute a hash value for that. We throw away the text for all the further processing stages. So the first step in our process is what we call the shingle table generation, where you take all the books, millions of books, and you shingle them, and you build a table that tells you that for each shingle, which books does it exist in and in which positions. So here we know, this is the end result, here we know that a shingle with a hash value of 10 exists in book A at position 3 and book B at position 22. So you already have sort of a hint that those two books have something in common. It might not be a quotation, but at least it's a run of text of the shingle size. So this ends up with a huge file or set of files of many terabytes. We then take that shingle table, and essentially what we want to do is say, well, we know all of the fixed size pieces. Can we expand those to the longest run of common pieces across books? We call those sequences. So we do that by basically distributing this shingle bucket to each book. And at this point, book A will see that it has something in common with book C and book D in position 1. Position 2, it has something in common with book C in position 29, book D in 20. So now book A can sort of linearly go through this table and find all the runs in all the other books that have in common. And what we end up with here is 20 billion sequences, a lot of sequences, that are the longest pieces of text that are in common between two books. So one problem, of course, is that sequences aren't precise. When people quote, they change text. We also have other issues. So what we do is, let me give you an example. When we have a sequence for a quote, here's a famous quote by Prime Minister Nehru about the Indian independence. Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny. And you see that somebody quotes just the first sentence. Somebody sort of quotes the first few words with an interjection, and then the rest, a couple of sentences. Here we have a situation where the E's on this scanned book are all mistaken for some other letter. And so actually our processing doesn't quite notice that long years ago we made as part of a quote because the OCR is in error. You get a similar effect if people sort of change the words, and you see that a lot. So we have this problem that when we look at the sequences, we have a lot of different forms of the quote running across the book. So we have to do a step that we call grouping. And there's many different ways to do this. You could do something like a string edit distance in this area, but since we didn't actually have the text, we basically did a simpler version, which is you sort of look and you see, well, which sequences, this might be the first sentence of a long quote, this might be the middle sentence of a long quote, this might be, the tail, which is dropped because of the Speech Act, for example, or some OCR errors. And you basically want to group these together and say all these pieces and all these books are really the same quote. So we call these candidate quotations at this point. And the filtering and ranking process is where we take these billions of candidates and we ask the question, well, which of these are just appearing in the front of a book or the back of a book, in which case they're most likely boilerplate, and you can get rid of those. Which of these have language features which are unusual? Too many numbers, so this gets rid of tables of logarithms and prime numbers. And we also have this concept of diffusion or information entropy, which says that a good quote is going to probably exist in more than one author, in more than one publisher. So if we see a quote that exists in 100 books, and all those books are by the same publisher, it's probably some kind of publisher boilerplate, maybe an advertisement at the back of the book or something. If you see a quote that only exists in one author, then it's probably some kind of self-quotation or something. If you see a quote that only exists in one of our library's sources, then it's also suspect, like the reserve book label that we picked up. So we have this notion that a good quote has been sort of distributed throughout the corpus and distributed throughout the publishers, distributed throughout the authors. And we can actually sort of get rid of some that have extremely low diffusion. But the next step is quotes that we believe are reasonable, we basically use a ranking. We demote very short quotes because those tend to be colloquial phrases that tend to repeat. We demote very long quotes because those tend to be short stories in books or letters that are repeating. or things that are too frequent. So we end up with tens of millions of rank quotations. And as I say, tens of thousands of CPU hours later. So this processing is multi-phase across multiple machines. So I run this over 2,000 or 4,000 machines, and it takes many days for it to run through these phases. Unfortunately, we currently only have a batch process for doing this. We don't have an incremental update. I can explain why later. So every few months, we run it again. And what we end up with is what we call a UI for doing within-book navigation and a UI for doing cross-book navigation. So I have like 2 static slides, and then I can switch to a video that shows you how the interaction feels. But we say within-book navigation. This is a little hard to see, but this is the book search page. You're reading the book over here, and on the right, you have the quotations. And this was one of the product manager decisions not to call it quotations because people would think of Bartlett's. So we actually call it popular passages. It's maybe a little bit more generic term. But what you see is that on page 52, there's this passage that repeats in 201 books from 1972 to 2007. And on page 49, there's this passage that occurs in 41 books in these years. So we have this way of basically clicking on the right-hand side and jumping to that passage. We call this within book, helps you find interesting stuff within the book. Obviously, you also want to jump to other books. What other book is talking about the same stuff? So here's a quote. "We know now that a text consists not of a line of words releasing a single theological meaning." It's a Roland Barthes quote, and it exists in, I don't know how many here, 94 books in our corpus. And we sort of list them like search results, and you can click on them and jump to that book. So yeah, you can go to the site and see a demo. I should mention that the UI has slightly changed over the last couple of weeks. Okay, sorry. Looks a little more manual. So this is what it looked like a few weeks ago. You're reading a book, Death of an Author, Richard Howard's book. On the right-hand side are the popular passages for the within book. This one, page 52, it occurs in 201 books. You could do more and see a little bit more of these. We actually sort of have a cutoff for how many of these popular passages we store per book. Some nice artifacts are going on here, which aren't part of the demo. Hang on, let me see if I can clean that up. Okay. So actually, the video looks a little bit different than is being shown here. I think we're having some update errors. Okay, and this shows you a cross-book navigation where once you find a quote and you say, well, let me find other books that are like that. Yeah. As you can see, my video is decaying rapidly. So you can go to the books.google.com website and try this. I should mention that the current version, we don't have that right-hand side that shows you the reading in the book. You have to go to the About the Book page, but if you dig around, you'll see it. So let me mention some evaluations. How do we know that we're doing good here? It's a real question. Nobody else has done this kind of data mining of quotations. So we did this thing where we have a ranking of good quotations, medium good quotations, bad quotations. And so we had this basic evaluation where you show people quotations and you say, does this seem like a quotation? Or does this seem like boilerplate, copyright page? Table of logarithms, does it seem like something else? So we did that evaluation 1, and we got a pretty high agreement between the human raters and our system that ranked them. So 88% agreement. So the stuff that we're showing users as good quotations is pretty good. And we also have the ability to look at use over time. So we launched this, and we have thousands of users who are using this. And we look at how do they use this kind of navigation versus the other types of navigation that's available. So the other types of navigation, when you're looking at a book, you can say, what other editions of the book are there? When you're looking at a book, you can say, what's related to this book? There's another link like that. And of course, there's cited by and citation links. So we can actually sort of look at how many users are using each feature, and we see that quotations are high. And part of that, but not all of that, is due to the coverage of quotations. So it turns out that citations, which are here and here, does cite and cites by, actually don't occur in all that many books. Quotations are much more popular way of doing references between books than formal citations. And you sort of expect that if you sort of look at biography, autobiography, many books in the humanities don't have this scientific discipline of having a strict quotation. So really by these three metrics, we had a pretty good idea that our system was a reasonable technique for providing this cross-book hypertext. So we launched this and we showed it to people and we got some feedback. And I want to describe the next step that we did, which is really still in the research lab. This step wasn't launched. When we showed the people the quotations work, they said, oh, that's great, but I don't necessarily want to go to a book in order to see quotations. I want to see quotations as first-class citizens, first-class entities. I want to be able to find a quotation, find related quotations, sort of use them to navigate. So we had this notion that ideas are sort of a subset of quotations. Maybe some quotations are not ideas, they're stories, but a lot of quotations really capture a concept well. And that's why authors are copying them from one book to the other. And this notion of sustainable development is captured in this Brundtland quotation. It's a key idea in eco-politics. So our idea was really to say, looking at a library, in our case, a huge digital library, not this nice library I have at home, could you ask the question, where are the ideas about tragedy? Where are the ideas about Christianity? Where are the ideas about eternal recurrence? And what's the most important stuff that Friedrich Nietzsche ever said? So, that's what we were trying to do, is bring out from a massive text corpus the ideas. And the problem here, of course, is, if you look at a book like Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, and you sort of just are looking at it, you're saying, well, where are the ideas there? If you read this, you also had that feeling. But I think there are some ideas in there. So that's really the problem, obviously based on our whole, project around mining quotations. This is built on it. But we were saying, how can you distinguish ideas from other words? At the surface, all these words look alike. And, of course, we're going to use this quotation idea. And the other problem is that when we talk about ideas like eco-politics or Christianity, there's really no common classification for those. So relations are hidden. So you might have one book talking about Stoicism, another book talking about cosmic determinism, and they're really talking about the same thing. And unless we have this kind of common labeling system or common classification system, how would you collect those? So these are the problems we're trying to solve, trying to link ideas across a major corpus. So I want to give you a little sort of review of history here. That we're not the first people to think about mining ideas and linking ideas and providing sort of an overview of the important concepts. So there was this project called The Great Ideas and the Great Books in the 50s. The University of Chicago and Encyclopedia Britannica published these books. And you can still buy them today. although they're not sold door to door, so don't wait for them to come to you. It's 443 works in 54 volumes, Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, Adam Smith, sort of that college coursework, the great books of the Western world, essentially. And it was really run by three characters, Professor Mortimer Adler at Chicago, Bob Hutchins, who was the CEO, president of University of Chicago, and William Benton, who was the CEO of Britannica. So they got together and had this initiative, really, to publish these books and also to publish something that they called the Syntopicon, which is the index to the great books. And what they were trying to do here was, in 2 volumes, sort of a little index to put together a reference of all of the ideas across these great works. So, here's Mortimer and his grad students. You can imagine, being a grad student working on this. They decided that 102 is the number of ideas in the world, or at least in the Western world. And so they have them here, from angel to world, and sort of in between is aristocracy, art, beauty, virtue, wisdom, big ideas, right? And they have these card catalogs that they use to do this, which is each card sort of had a reference to all the books where that idea existed, or the important mentions. It took them 7 years, 50 indexers, 75 clerical staff. It really blew the budget of this great books project. It was sort of a problem for Britannica at the time. And as you can imagine, after they did this great books and great ideas, there was a great critique that came. Of course, educators are famous for critiquing each other. Here, maybe rightly so. One of the big critiques was that, they selected the great books. And it was really based in one tradition, this sort of Western world idea. And it was, as I say, 12 men sitting in a room. There were a lot of things that were missing from the books and from the ideas that were in those books. They didn't have the notion of equality, civil rights, and other things. And there was basically no, all of these authors of all these books were white males until about the 90s, when the 3rd edition came out, and then some women were added and some minorities were added. So, clearly there was some criticism that they're not our great ideas. And, my criticism is, well, it's not, not my books either. I'm not reading Plato every day. But, I'm reading for economics, and I'm reading Noam Chomsky for beginners. And how could we do this stuff that Mortimer Adler was doing in the Syntopicon for my books? So our approach, building on this idea of we've mined the quotations, is we use the quotations to represent the popular ideas. And we use what we call the popular terms near the quotes as labels. So we think of the quotations as the text, and the words before and after the quotations are the context. And those are key for doing this. So here's an example. Here's a quote, Justice Stevens' opinion in this Bush v. Gore Supreme Court case that has about 81 instances the last time I looked. And although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the law. So this quote appears in 81 books here, and we look at the context of the quote. And we pull out words that sort of repeat in the context. And basically what we're doing here is the people who quote are labeling this quote with some terms. And it's basically a wisdom in the crowds or a voting effect. If you see Justice John Paul Stevens enough, you say, oh, that is probably some kind of label or relation to this quote. We don't actually know what the meaning of John Paul Stevens is, but we know that it somehow is related. So this is what we did. Without editors, without those 12 men sitting in a room, just our 2,000 or 4,000 computers sitting in a data center, we tried to have the ideas emerge and the labels and connections between those ideas emerge. So this is the user interface that we developed internally. This isn't launched. And one way we evaluated it was we just took a key term that wasn't really a great idea, like virtue, but we thought had some associated quotations and concepts, and that word was space race. And what we see here is you type in space race, you get a list of quotes that are related to space race. In other words, people, when they use this quote, they have some context for that quote that often has the word space race. When you look at a particular quote, you can see related key terms. So you can sort of pivot from space race to Apollo 11 or Buzz Aldrin. This is one book. And we can also do this kind of pivoting across all the books. So these are more general terms that appear via co-occurrence. So you might see here space race and Cold War might not appear in any one of these, but Cold War does appear here. There's a relationship between those two. And just let me give you a caveat that, why we didn't launch this. There's still a lot of work to be done. We have a number of problems. I don't know if anyone noticed this, but it says that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and it was first published in 1868. And yes, so I don't know, conspiracy theories aside, it's probably not true. And this is a metadata problem. So each book in our collection has some metadata, like publication date, author, et cetera. And some of the metadata is a little bit funky, like you might have a periodical or a serial, like Scientific American or National Geographic, or a series of poetry. And we basically found that it's always been labeled with the date of the first edition, first volume, first edition. So when we sort of found this, then we went to our metadata people, and they said, oh yeah, we know about that, we're fixing it. But so these are kinds of things that pop up. The other is that our key term extractor was not so great. We have John F. and President John, sort of all variations. Just because key term extractors are really using statistical methods, and statistical methods sort of break down in our particular niche style of doing this extraction. So I want to point out that what's going on here when we have these labels and we have these longer descriptions is you can sort of look at a label and follow the connections. So what I did here was I took our system and I typed in Stanley Milgram as a key term, and then I saw the co-occurring key terms for that. And I think I did this maybe twice and picked out a few that were interesting. So Stanley Milgram, who was a famous social scientist at Yale in the 60s who did the 6 degrees of separations research. He was a cultural anthropologist. He wrote on the Holocaust. He had a collaborator, Irving Goffman. These are all sort of things that you might find related to, I don't know, the concept of Stanley Milgram or Stanley Milgram's writings and his work. So you can see here that you have a pretty good way of looking at co-occurring terms based on this common text that is being used across books. So I want to point out that what we're doing with mining quotations and what we're doing with mining the terms in the context of the quotations is really kind of a smart crowd effect. So there's two types, or at least people talk about two types of collective intelligence that's out there. One is the style that is being used for the Wikipedia, where a lot of people collaborate together on an article. And then there's this other style, crowd wisdom, where a lot of people independently are doing something, and you can sort of compute over that and come up with some greater answer, greater intelligence. So James Surowiecki, who wrote this book, Wisdom of the Crowd, sort of defines it as, the community needs to be diverse, decentralized, needs a way of summarizing the opinions, and we have both in the quotations. We can find pieces of text that are being most quoted. So that's the way we can summarize. They're independent. These authors didn't talk to each other. And basically, what we're doing here is we're letting the authors themselves, who copy text from one piece to another, define what's important. And we're letting the authors who introduce quotations define how to label them. And so very much we're doing this smart crowds. So let me just mention, in closing, I have related work and a future work. Very much this work has been influenced by the history of hypertext, in particular Ted Nelson's notion of transclusion. So this was an early form of linking. Ted Nelson had the idea that you could take pieces of documents and connect them. Now, he had this idea that you would do this while you're authoring the document. You would actually sort of be typing a document and maybe find another document that you wanted to include, and you'd do something with a concept called an edit change list. And it was a very authoring model. In our case, what we did was we basically data mined this transclusion network. Ted Nelson came to Google, gave a talk. We had many meetings with him about this. So we're a fan of his. I should mention in future work, what we've done is really traded these 12 men in a room for, an entire library and the ideas that come out of that, library. But that library is actually aggregated over many different sources, 23 partner libraries and publishers and et cetera. And it's actually interesting to start asking the question, how can we take cuts or subsets of this huge digital library and look at the ideas that emerge and the differences of the ideas that emerge from that? So one cut you could take is a time-based cut and see, what's happening in time. Now, this isn't ideas here. This is, the history of, America. But you can ask the question, what ideas grew in popularity over time and then sort of decayed in popularity? Or can we compare, the Vatican Library to the Berkeley Humanities Library? I expect there's some differences in the ideas that come out of those two. Or you could look at, the geography of the ideas. We have the locations for the publications of the books. We know which countries they were written in, where they were published, so we can ask the various cultures. So these are the kinds of things, once we have this collection, you can start taking cuts and asking interesting questions about the evolution. So in conclusion, what we've been doing here is mining quotations for a couple of different purposes: for linking interesting information, for finding information in books, and also for exposing these repeated ideas and for navigating the ideas. So it's, Google's mantra is to organize the world's information and make it accessible and useful. And this seems like a good way of taking that ocean of text and turning it into something more. So I should say that, I'm a researcher in the research group. I worked with researchers in the product group to do this. And it's sort of a unique characteristic of Google that you go do that. You have these massive data sets that aren't available anywhere else. And if you're interested in finding out more, we have 2 papers that are online on my webpage. My last name is very googly. Like, I don't have many doppelgangers at all, or Google gangers. So go and find my last name, look at the publications page. We have one paper published on this key ideas notion and one published on the linking and the generative hypertext. So thank you very much. So questions?
A little while ago, you made a comment about the important properties of the process. One you said was that the pieces of data be independent. The way you put it, right?
Yeah.
It seemed to me that what was going on in your process is that the evaluation of each of the pieces of data is independent. In fact, you were looking for dependencies,
Yes.
correlations, and relations that
Yes.
are not visible. You can't know whether the data is dependent or independent.
Yeah.
You may derive that, but
Yeah.
you can't know ahead.
Yeah. So the question was about, the independence of the data or what is that about? And when James Surowiecki sort of characterized this, he was talking more about the people. He said, well, we read it, people in the crowd need to be independent, so they pay attention mostly to their own information. They're sort of making independent judgments about what's important. And it's that you're trying to aggregate. But they actually sort of settle on things that are dependent. They are sort of related. That's the key, right? They're pulling out stuff, right? So they're voting with their pens, basically. Yeah.
So without being too proprietary of a question, how much of your work is influenced by bioinformatics now and ongoing? It seems like many of the techniques you're doing are bioinformatics, sequence similarity co-occurrence.
Right. So basically, I spent a long time looking for algorithms to do this because I don't like writing algorithms. And, and it turns out that we could not find any algorithms that work on this size data set. So we're certainly influenced very much by the bioinformatics algorithms, including, basically these algorithms try and find a common piece and then expand from there. So I think you can see a relationship with what we're doing and that. It turns out that our data set is much, much larger than the DNA data sets. Interestingly enough, I always thought DNA was huge. And their data sets are much, much noisier than our data sets. So the DNA motif or repeat discovery is really about trying to find the protein binding sites on molecule chains. And as you can see here, it's a lot more statistical in what they're doing. So we have some errors, but we actually don't have this kind of statistical problem. Yeah.
Recently, Google got accused of making the world stupid, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder, with regard to that, whether this kind of develop this kind of basis just along the lines of summarizing all of human knowledge and very sophisticated ideas, so that a book, which may require a complete read to even fully to begin to understand the concepts of the author, gets reduced to popularly ranked, whoever's the ranker, snippets of concepts. And is that something you think about?
Oh, that wasn't our intent. Our intent was not to make the world stupider. But yeah, obviously. I think that the world with access to information, easy search, sort of has, people tend to do a lot of navigation around. Maybe they don't read as long or as deeply. And I see this as a way of, when you're reading a secondary source, to jump into the primary source and really find out what that meant. So it really allows a deeper kind of investigation. Or if you're reading a primary source, you don't quite understand what this is about, to read an analysis. I don't see that is really causing too much fragmentation in the thought process. It's more like Vannevar Bush's following trails. You're still on a topic, you're still on a theme, but you happen to be moving from work to work. That's what Syntopicon and syntopical reading is about. It's taking an idea or a theme and reading across many different sources at once, and that's what this gives you the power to do.
From a technical point of view, how much does the success of this technique depend upon the quotes or excerpts having a well-defined beginning and end versus things that kind of, I might leave a few words in and you might take them out.
Yeah.
They get kind of fuzzy with the actual.
Yeah. Good question. So it's about the beginning and the ends, and basically the fuzziness. And it's actually turned into one of the harder problems is getting those beginning and ends. And you see here, this quote doesn't quite begin at the beginning. So it turns out that as long as you have like a big enough segment of a quote, you could sort of say it's a quote without actually knowing its beginning. And I do this kind of processing, which is analogous to Manhattan skyline. So if we have a lot of versions of the quote, you can sort of look at which are the most frequent pieces of the quote and sort of say, well, it jumps up here, so this is almost like the most frequently used first sentence. But definitely it's an issue trying to find where a quote begins and ends, especially as people introduce them differently and split them up. And if we have enough versions of the quote, like if you have a couple of hundred, and a lot of quotes do have a couple of hundred, then you can use statistical methods to look at those and start counting up the frequency of the words within. Yes?
I'm curious, have you done a comparison at all between the appearance of attributed quotes versus unattributed quotes? It's called the Biden test.
Yeah. The plagiarism question. So no.
Not necessarily, but have you done a comparison?
No. So I think the way to do that is to use human evaluators. It's sort of hard to, maybe, I don't know, but I think it's hard to come up with an algorithm to see whether a quote is properly attributed. But we did stumble across, of course, a number of unattributed quotations and outright, plagiarism, whole sections of books. So, one of the things we'd like to do is you treat the context of the quote a little bit more intelligently and sort of look for basically correct attribution and maybe even sentiment. So you can actually have some more knowledge about how this quote is being used. Yes?
So going along with page rank, do you do any kind of weighting by so if someone refers to something, what is that source's rank, or every vote is kind of counted equally, also by domains. If some idea or quotation is referred in different domains in biology and politics versus constantly. So you have this concept of diffusion, so is diffusion just across like a few entities, or is it?
So we only do stupid stuff right now. So basically, trying to get from beginning to end. PageRank is a great idea. Analyzing this network, basically, is a great idea, and we'd love to do that. It says a lot that these quotes, basically which quotes are in a book, which other quotes are in a book. That the books are related because they share some quotes, and so you have a whole network of quotation, like co-occurring links. And you can basically run something like PageRank across that, and maybe out would emerge the most important quote in the world, right? Yeah.
I think the partial automatic process for attribution. If you could, if you would, associate anonymous author for each instance of a quote where it's out of, and then look for the instance of the other authors
Yeah.
in that group nearby in that
Yes.
in the quote. That's an indication, a positive indication of attribution.
Yeah.
To really do it, you need human help, but
Yeah. Well, attribution is actually something that is computable, I believe. And we had a volunteer working with us to try and do attribution. We're trying to do this across 100 languages, so we can't look for speech acts like Nixon wrote. But we did have a few good statistical techniques for attribution to pop up, things like you mentioned. Co-occurrence of the name, right? Yeah, even just getting a good list of names across languages is tough. So it's amazing, but yeah.
It'd be interesting to mine the web for book quotations and then trend to that and see if you have an effect.
And so what was the?
If this causes a rise in book quotations.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so there's a long cycle here on people writing books, right?
No, see if you have an influence on the web quoting more books
Oh, okay.
through the deployment of this tool.
Yeah. We actually have another technique for people to take book pieces and put them into web pages, which is another type of quotation. So when you visit the site, if you visit a public domain book, you can actually pull out images. So there's someone in the back there.
Applying this to scientific databases, it sounds mostly like you've been concentrating on non-scientific books.
Yeah. So scientific databases.
Patents might be an example.
Yeah, or we actually have another product called scholar.google.com, which indexes scientific papers. Those tend to have a lot of citations already in them. And so, yeah, so what we find is that in scientific papers, not always, but often, they're using sort of the citation and citation reference to do linking rather than copying big blocks. So, you know, we sort of see it as an analogous way of doing linking, but there are different styles that authors use. Way back.
You quoted that 88% of the automatically extracted quotes coincide with well-defined human interpreted quotes.
It wasn't quite that, but yeah. So. Is there a question?
Can you clarify, basically, are those all the quotes in the book, or are they basically missing, and do you have an idea what
Yeah, so what we did there was we basically, we had millions of quotations, and we wanted to know, you know, and we have a rank list of them basically for every book. We wanted to know the ones that had a high score, are those really good things to show users? Or those really look like a quotation? Or is it, you know, the table of logarithms? So what we did was basically you take some from the high scoring set and some from the low scoring set, and you show these to users, and you don't tell them which is which, and you ask them to rate on a Likert scale, you know, from 0 to 5, from awful to great. You ask them to rate, does this seem like a quote to you? And we had a little, you know, short definition of what a quote is, you know, memorable, historical, meaningful. And basically, when these human raters looked at something that we rated highly, they also rated it highly. And when they looked at something that we rated low, they also rated it low. So that was the evaluation that we were doing. We wanted to validate our ranking method.
The number of extractions per book, let's say the content that's in the book. You didn't say basically 88% of the content of this book is extracted from quotes. That was
No, but there is a related kind of metric which is called coverage, which is basically asking, I can't find it now, which is basically asking how many books in the corpus have quotations in them. This is sort of, you know, the idea there is you want to say, well, this, you know, if you're going to generate links between books, it's nice to have lots of books that have this feature. You know? So what we found is that a large number, I didn't quite remember what it was, but a large number of books had quotations larger than any of the other styles that currently exist for creating links. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on some of the issues in making it incremental? The technical issues, I assume?
Yeah, so we have this database of quotations, and you toss a new book in, and you shingle it, and you sequence it. And as long as you've seen a quote before, it'll work, it'll fall into it. But if that book contains the second instance of a quote, you've already thrown out, you know, all the non-quote data from your data set in processing phases. So if you do that too much over time, basically you're going to start missing quotes. So that's the main problem is, you know, probably we need to, you know, as I said, this is multi-phases. I think there's like 7 or 8 phases that are going on here. We need to sort of maintain data further into the pipeline in order to do this incremental. Turns out that it's just easier, you know, spend another 24 hours and regenerate it. in our minds.
So maybe one more question.
Okay.
I was gonna, can you detect quotes that have been translated into other languages? And that probably the shingle technique might not work, but it's not about the challenge.
Yeah, so you can detect, books that are non-English. You can detect quotes in those, obviously. You can detect books that are in, let's say, French books that have English quotes and English books that have French quotes. But you can't correlate the translations. This is the version in English and this is the version in French. That's hard. You can run Google Translate. But actually, since we're talking about language, I do have a funny slide. I want to point out, what happens. One of the complaints we got at the very end. Hang on. And I'll end with this. What we call language bias. Here's a book. I believe it's Dutch. Maybe somebody could help me. And all the quotes are in English. Somebody was really upset with this, rightly so. I'm sure this had some wonderful Dutch quotes in it, but frankly, they just weren't as popular as these English quotes. Because, there's a lot more English books in the world.
Dutch books.
What?
You didn't have the Dutch books.
Not only that, but even if we had all of the Dutch books, it would not compare to the English books that are in the world. So basically, these come out as a lot more popular. So when we're processing all these books in all these different languages, you basically want to boost sort of the native language of the book and ask the question, in these 15 books that this quote appears, is it the same language as this book, the source book? So that we, basically can have books that are in one language sort of represented with quotes in that same language. So with that, I'll thank you again.